Since 2019, the number of satellites circling the Earth has more than doubled, the result of a new space race. Private companies and governments are competing to see who can gain the upper hand in the lucrative orbital space market. While their satellites have become an integral part of everyday life on our planet, the rapid launch of thousands of new ones is deepening concerns about how they're being used and the potential dangers of overcrowding Earth's orbit. People in Power investigates.
The heavens above have once again captured the minds and imaginations of those living below.
This space industry is in a space renaissance, like we've not seen even during the Apollo program.
This renaissance is not just a competition between superpowers, but a race between billionaires and private companies.
It is maybe the greatest opportunity in technology and communication, but there are plenty of risk involved in it as well.
And this risk and reward is changing everything, from the way the world connects to the way it wages war.
The war in Ukraine has really underlined that, the role of space has changed and the role of commercial space has changed.
We set out to investigate the vast cultural, political, and policy implications of this renaissance, exploring how the shift in space from public to private is changing nearly every aspect of life on Earth and transforming the night sky. At the Smoky Jack Observatory in West Cliff, Colorado, the alteration is already on display. With the help of telescopes and amateur astronomer Steve McAllister, this stargazing outpost offers clear sightlines to the night's timeless constellations.
The Big Dipper is actually the Big Bear, which is Ursa Major. Here's the back leg.
But the night sky McAllister knows so well is changing.
You're going to see a lot of satellites tonight, and maybe a satellite train will come over. They do that fairly often.
Moving across the sky like flecks of sand, there are nearly 10,000 satellites circling the Earth, double the number since 2019.
Yeah, it's a little bit annoying for someone that grew up with very few satellites and being able to look up in the sky and rarely seeing one, and now they're zipping across all the time.
For astronomers, these bits of light are an unwelcome distraction. But like it or not, they're not going anywhere. These orbiting specks, markers of an entirely new era in space.
3, 2, 1.
But none of this happens without the arrival of SpaceX, the private space company owned by billionaire Elon Musk. When SpaceX launched its Falcon 9 spacecraft in 2015, it became the first private reusable rocket to successfully go to space, deploy satellites, and come back. This breakthrough dramatically cut the cost to carry and deliver satellites into orbit.
SpaceX was a catalyst and boon to the whole industry. They did the audacious thing of actually saying we can lower the cost of launch.
Matt Desch is the CEO of Iridium. Founded during the Reagan administration, the Virginia-based company is one of the oldest private satellite operators in the world. And they are currently the only company with a network of satellites that span the entire globe. Last year, they completed an upgrade of their entire system. All 81 satellites carried into space by Musk's Falcon 9 rockets.
They offered for less than $500 million to launch all my satellites. The next best bid I had was like $1.3 billion.
This cost reduction has opened the space market. For years, Iridium had few competitors, but now the field is growing.
Amazon is launching their Kuiper network. OneWeb is up there, many others. There's some networks that are being proposed right now with 100,000 satellites. People were alarmed when Iridium launched in the late 90s. 66 satellites in space, my God, that's so many. I mean, today, Starlink already has 4,000 in space, and they plan on many, many thousands more.
This massive expansion, part of a broad effort to collect, lease, or sell nearly every aspect of the 21st century digital world by connecting the nearly 3 billion global citizens currently without access to broadband internet. The Ho tribe, on the Olympic Peninsula of Washington, more than 3 hours away from Seattle, was one of the first pilot projects for Starlink.
It's enabled them to engage in education, It's enabled them to engage in telehealth.
Mark Visconti is the director of the Washington State Broadband Office.
We're trying to fill in all of these white spaces and lighter colored spaces.
Visconti's office is charged with expanding broadband internet access to the most rural households that remain unconnected, a task that will take years of infrastructure development.
From the standpoint of speed to deployment, satellite service can clearly fill in a gap. The people that I know who have utilized Starlink have found it to be life-changing. It's enabled them to conduct businesses that they otherwise wouldn't be able to.
While satellites are transforming rural America, they're also transforming the battlefield.
In the days leading up to the conflict, we were showing some images of the convoy that we were able to capture. These clearly are military vehicles.
Tony Frazier is the executive vice president of Maxar, which provides satellite imagery to the U.S. Defense Department and commercial clients. In February 2022, the company's 4 satellites provided a real-time portrait of Russia's military assembly around Ukraine. They would document early evidence of Russian attacks on civilians.
We began to capture and share evidence of artillery being fired indiscriminately to civilian locations. And here is an image over an airport in Hostomel, Ukraine.
This surveillance capability was not lost on the Russians.
When they first did their invasion of Ukraine, they also did a cyber attack against Viasat ground terminals because they wanted to disrupt Ukrainian communications.
Victoria Sampson is the Washington office director of the Secure World Foundation, a private organization that works to promote space sustainability and peaceful uses of outer space.
They also disrupted a lot of communications of a good chunk of Europe. It took out tens of thousands of terminals.
Russia's Viasat attack made clear that the rules of engagement had changed. War now included private space companies, most notably Elon Musk's SpaceX and Starlink. Just 2 days into the Russian attack, Ukraine's Minister of Digital Transformation made a 140-character plea to Elon Musk, writing, "While your rockets successfully land from space, Russian rockets attack Ukrainian civilian people. We ask you to provide Ukraine with Starlink stations." That same day, Musk responded, "Starlink service is now active in Ukraine." More than 42,000 Starlink terminals are now being used in Ukraine for everything from communication for artillery teams to internet for hospitals. But there are concerns about Starlink's outsized impact on the war, most notably that a private company controlled by the world's wealthiest person holds so much power. The connection to Starlink to wage war has been limited in Ukraine. The company publicly stated that it took steps to prevent Starlink from being used for long-range drone strikes. And Ukrainian forces have reported sudden loss of Starlink service during counteroffensives into Russian-held territory. This happening around the time SpaceX was complaining about the estimated $400 million a year it cost to maintain the service and threatening to cut it off if the Pentagon didn't pick up the tab. There have also been reports that Musk prevented his Starlink service from being used for a critical Ukrainian drone attack on Russia's Black Sea fleet, a claim Musk recently confirmed.
This was kind of like a Pearl Harbor type attack on Sevastopol, on the Russian fleet in Sevastopol. So they're really asking us to really proactively take part in a major act of war.
In June, the Pentagon announced a deal with SpaceX to underwrite Starlink service to Ukraine, but concerns remain.
So countries like China, like Russia, they say, well, perhaps a company like Starlink, it's more of a U.S. government entity than a commercial entity.
Go Starlink.
In fact, the satellite space race is potentially giving private companies an unprecedented ability to shape military conflict and geopolitics. We wanted to speak with Musk and SpaceX about that, but they did not respond to our request for an interview.
There's an intertwining of commercial space, of national security space, and it just shows how much we're interwoven with each other. Much as when we try and say, well, this is not my issue, this is not something that's relevant to me, it definitely affects all.
Satellites are also playing an integral role in the ways in which those outside of the war zone are monitoring and documenting military actions that violate international law.
The joke is we travel to Ukraine every day, and we do so in low Earth orbit.
Nathaniel Raymond leads Yale University's Humanitarian Research Lab. From Sudan to Ukraine and Russia, Raymond's team uses satellite imagery to monitor active conflicts, documenting as troops or militias burn villages, bomb hospitals, and displace civilians.
We are basically a digital version of crime scene investigator, but we're not doing it on the ground with plastic bags. We're doing it from space.
In February, the team exposed an alleged Russian operation illegally relocating and resettling thousands of Ukrainian children.
Russian officials were taking selfies in front of the buses with the kids in them as they were going to the camps. And so from that, we were able to get metadata about the GPS location of those buses. We started to use satellites at that point to identify and confirm precise GPS locations of the re-education camps where many of the kids were being held, and other facilities, including psychiatric hospital and what's called family centers.
1 month later, the International Criminal Court issued a warrant for the arrest of Vladimir Putin. It accused the Russian president and his subordinates of unlawfully deporting and transferring children. Action, the court says, constitute a war crime.
It is forbidden by international law for occupying powers to transfer civilians from the territory they live in to other territories.
Russia rejects the allegations, but privately owned satellites, including some launched in recent years, have helped gather evidence to back up these claims.
It's the satellites combined with cloud computing, combined with advancements in artificial intelligence, analytics. In the past, we were playing one instrument in the orchestra, like the cello. Now we're playing the orchestra.
This all goes back to the first beeps from the Russian Sputnik satellite in 1957, but became more sophisticated in the early 60s during the first space race.
This is President Eisenhower speaking. It is a great personal satisfaction to participate.
On August 12, 1960, President Dwight Eisenhower's words were transmitted from California and reflected off a massive balloon called Echo 1 to a laboratory station in Holmdel, New Jersey, kicking off the satellite communications era.
In this first experiment in communications,
judged by contemporary standards, the early days of satellite imagery was an even cruder exercise.
Before we had digital radio download, they literally had a canister of film that had to be shot out of the satellite and caught by a plane at high altitude. And it would come with a scoop net, and they had to catch it in the net.
In the 1960s, the U.S. Air Force operated a spy satellite program known as Corona. Using a panoramic camera, the satellite took the first detailed photographs from space.
It was completely analog. It captured images in film, dropped those canisters, and then it would take weeks to process the data to be able to provide insight.
Now we're at a moment where we are downloading terabytes beyond all of the imagery that was collected in that era every day. We are now at daily refresh, where the surface of the Earth can technically be painted every day.
These paintings, largely from private satellites, have not only opened our understanding of the Earth, but introduced an array of ethical questions.
You can type the make and model of a car very easily on very high resolution imagery. What if we're talking about domestic abuser who's wanting to see if his or her former partner has a new romantic interest? You can now track that car. Open data may be great if you're sitting in downtown San Francisco at a Blue Bottle coffee shop, but for the most vulnerable people on the planet, open data is a potential nightmare scenario in the sense that data is power, data is people.
This deluge of open data is primarily the result of the increasing frequency and declining costs of launch pioneered by SpaceX. Today, there is intense competition to drive down the cost even further. In the desert of New Mexico, Spin Launch, a California-based company, is working on a way to take rockets out of the launch process altogether.
We've been relying upon rockets as the only means of transporting payloads into Earth orbit for the last 70 years. And rockets are very complicated, they are very expensive, and they are very inefficient.
CEO Jonathan Yaney and his company have assembled what they call a suborbital accelerator, an electrically powered kinetic launch system that spins a rocket-like projectile at high velocity inside a vacuum chamber to launch, greatly reducing the need for rocket fuel and allowing for bigger payloads.
We can do each launch for a few $100,000, so we're talking orders of magnitude lower costs than any other launch system out there.
Yaney says they're currently looking for a location to host their much larger and commercially ready orbital accelerator, which will be capable of reaching space.
We can launch in, as little as a few days of notice. What you have as a customer is a much more turnkey solution. You couple that with the low-cost small satellites that the industry is now producing, what you have is really an overhaul of access to space. These companies now, instead of taking a decade and billions of dollars to deploy large-scale satellite constellations in low Earth orbit, can now do so, for single-digit millions.
But this drive to make access to space even more affordable is paving the way for a new telecommunications land rush that points to the potential for catastrophic collisions in space. In 2009, a defunct Russian satellite collided with an Iridium satellite just as they were crossing over northern Siberia.
I got a call from my chief satellite officer at the time, and he said, "I have bad news and worse news. Which do you want first?" And I said, "What's the bad news?" And he said, "We lost track of our satellite SV-33 somewhere over Siberia." I said, "What's the worst news?" And he said, "It could have ran into something else." And I said, "Okay, I'm not experienced at this. How often does that happen?" And he said, "It's never happened in the history of space flight since Sputnik that any two things in space inadvertently ran into each other."
The collision destroyed both satellites, scattering 1,800 pieces of debris into low Earth orbit.
It really did change the industry at the time, because it was sort of a shock that this sort of thing could happen and that space wasn't so big, that two things could inadvertently run into each other. And the reasons why they did was because we could have easily moved the satellite, but we didn't have good information to move it before that.
After the collision, industry and government officials began to track and share information about the orbital path of satellites. Then, in 2020, the newly formed U.S. Space Force began operating the Space Fence surveillance system, a $1.5 billion radar system capable of tracking objects in space as small as a marble.
Even with the vastness of space, without some sort of organization, we're going to see more and more issues.
Melanie Strickland, a former Air Force officer, is the co-founder of Slingshot Aerospace, a Texas-based company that provides navigational support for the public and private space industry. Slingshot uses information from commercial satellites in their Slingshot Beacon service, which acts as an air traffic control for space, helping to avoid collisions with another satellite or a large piece of space debris.
We're very busy, very, very busy. We've got 93% of satellites in low Earth orbit leveraging Slingshot Beacon today to deconflict their spaceflight operations and ensure that they don't have any critical conjunctions.
But Slingshot is not working with a complete data set. The world's satellite operators from the US to China are currently not operating under a cooperative and standardized space traffic management system.
Today, national and regional entities monitor space activities with different sets of standards, best practices, definitions, languages, and modes of interoperability.
For the past 5 years, the Secure World Foundation has gathered leaders from the private space sector and the world's governments in an attempt to foster coordination. Last year, they met in New York. The Undersecretary General for Policy at the United Nations, Guy Ryder, gave the opening keynote address.
If we cannot agree on how to coordinate space traffic management, we risk both the safety and the sustainability of space through accidents that will lead to the destruction of orbits and, worryingly, the breach of peace and security in outer space.
Among last year's attendees, Richard Dalbello, the director of the U.S. Office of Space Commerce, the agency responsible for commercial space policy in the United States.
It's very difficult to compare two completely separately derived solutions. So you get into a what is truth problem. As we've recently had examples, for a very concrete example with China, where China had alleged that certain U.S. satellite operators were flying too close to their space station. Our data indicated that it was not true. And so without worrying about who was right or who was wrong, this is the kind of confusion that I'm talking about, where two operators, maybe both with the very best of intentions, come to a disagreement because they don't understand how each of their systems works.
At last year's summit in New York, a main point of discussion was the need for a moratorium on the testing of anti-satellite missiles, or so-called ASAT tests. In 2021, Russia became the latest country to test anti-satellite weapons, firing a missile into a long-defunct Soviet-era satellite, sending more than 1,500 new pieces of debris into orbit.
Well, first of all, let me acknowledge that the U.S. has done ASAT tests in the past, decided that this is not an advisable course. The Russians did one very recently. The Chinese and the Indians also did ASAT tests. Whatever the politics are between countries, this is just potentially destroying an environment for a test.
I now put to vote.
In December of last year, 155 nations voted in favor of a UN resolution encouraging nations not to conduct anti-satellite tests. 9 opposed the measure, including Russia and China. India abstained. But even with an agreed-upon moratorium on anti-satellite testing, a mess may be coming by way of what is known as the Kessler syndrome.
The Kessler syndrome is like what you saw in the movie Gravity. It's a debris-on-debris event. It's catastrophic.
An object causes debris. That debris splatters in space, hitting other objects, causing more debris to get a waterfall.
Depending on the altitude, those debris could stay up there for hundreds of years or tens of years.
And this would not only increase the possibility of collisions, but could prevent human access to space entirely.
In the early days, we had a Cold War mentality with very limited objects in space. But now we're to a fundamentally different game.
Dan Oltrogge is the chief scientist at Comstock, a company that predicts the paths of objects in orbit. Comstock has created a number of models of what the Earth's orbit will look like as the satellite population continues to grow.
Those videos give you an appreciation for just how many objects could be launched and active in space. And the problem with these fragmentation events is it continues to introduce more and more of these fragments that we now have to track. And if you think of sort of running to your car and it's just barely sprinkling, you can kind of run almost between the drops if you go really fast. If it's raining a lot, you can't. You're just going to get hit by something.
Melanie Strickland says this scenario can be avoided, but only if efforts are made to organize space traffic.
It's at a tipping point, and we have a small window of opportunity to curtail, a catastrophic debris-on-debris event. Most human beings on this Earth are enabled by the satellite capabilities, whether it's the blue dot on your phone, the navigation systems that you use, transportation, global transportation, weather, disaster response. And so a day without space would be catastrophic to the human race. We'd see ourselves go back in time to the 50s or before.
But finding consensus in space will require a dramatic shift in consensus on the ground. It will also require getting a handle on the new power of private satellite operators and how to regulate them.
Historically, space was dominated by nation states. And if you had a concern about other activities in space, you would take it to the United Nations. But now, one of the biggest actors in space is not a national government, it's a commercial actor. And so if you have concerns about what SpaceX is doing, do you take it to the US government? Do you take it to the United Nations? Where do you take these sort of concerns and how do you discuss these sort of things?
Stage separation confirmed.
The implications of the new satellite space race are far-reaching, not only in space, but here on the ground.
With our naked eye, we're supposed to be able to see about 1,000 stars. So now if you add another, 60,000 satellites, so suddenly you've increased the star count 60-fold, right? So instead of 1,000, it's going to be 60,000. This is going to be a different sky.